It has been brought to my attention that it is Dr. Cadell Last's birthday. So happy birthday, Cadell. Davoud put it very well when he said a birthday is an opportunity to express things that you always want to express and you're looking for that opportunity to do so. And I appreciated how Davoud put that. And I think that it being your birthday, it is 7/7/22 over here in the States, in Virginia. And the World Spirit has brought us Dr. Last's birthday. So I think one of the things that is very impressive about Dr. Last is his ability to analyze exactly the issues that philosophy needs to be addressing and taking seriously right now. It's very tempting and easy to get lost in the history of philosophy. Often when people talk about teaching philosophy, especially in an academic and university setting, it can seem like what they're actually talking about is the history of philosophy. Now, don't get me wrong. It's important to know the history of philosophy, as it can be useful to know the history of art if one wants to write a book or to go into the arts or different things like that. But it becomes very tempting to stay in the history of philosophy and to just teach the information of philosophy, as opposed to actually be a philosopher and to feel it in your bones and to live it. Because if you actually live philosophy, it's very consequential. It means a lot. It means that you, every single day, are going to be called to do something more than what you did the day before. That you are going to be inspired by your own convictions of what is true and right to overcome yourself and to rise to a higher condition and to condition yourself to ever rise ever more. That's what philosophy, I think, demands of us, especially in the tradition of, say, Nietzsche or Hegel, which are two thinkers that Dr. Last has taught on very well. Which brings to mind, one of the things I think is very impressive about Dr. Last is his ability to teach on subjects or thinkers that you think you knew, but then when you attend his class or listen to his lectures, you feel like you're learning them for the first time. It brings to mind the return in Hegel, where you never return, because you never step in the same river twice, as that Heraclitus notion goes. Return is always, the RE is always in parentheses. And I think Dr. Last, there is that Heraclitus experience when one is enjoying reviewing the work of Dr. Last, because you're like, oh, I never saw that in Nietzsche. Oh, I never thought of Hegel that way. Oh, Freud, goodness. I first found myself amazed by Dr. Last's work in his Return to Freud class. It was indeed, I had read the Interpretation of Dreams, Civilization's Discontent, so on and so forth. Clearly, I didn't read them, though. That's always funny with some of these great books. You read them and then you find out you didn't read them, because I certainly did not absorb out of those texts what Dr. Last brought to the forefront. And indeed, it's very difficult to go through Dr. Last's Return to Freud class and the conversations that he facilitated. And it's very difficult to facilitate conversation, and Dr. Last does so very well. One of the reasons it's hard to facilitate conversation, like in universities, we'll talk about, we'll have a lecture and then a discussion. Well, the lecture has to be inspiring. It's very difficult when, you had your professor give that lecture and then he sat down and it's like, let's discuss, and you go, I was asleep. And you don't really feel inspired, or you just have someone sitting who brought to the conversation some ideas they wanted to say ahead of time, and all they basically do is just say that. But it's not really the lecture that inspired the conversation. It's the needing to get a good grade that forces the conversation, or what happens is people bring preset complexes, ideas, and presents those, which is not really a conversation but a collective monologue. It is a collection of people who come together to monologue. In Dr. Last's classes, it's very clear that the lecture inspires conversation, that people want to talk after the presentation. You'll see it in the live chats, on the videos that he does, or the live streams that he does. It inspires. What he says inspires. That's a very rare form of teaching, I think. Most teaching today is simply the imparting of information from one brain to another. It is not necessarily inspiring, and Dr. Last's work is inspiring. It certainly has inspired me. It would be very difficult to reference all of the papers that have been inspired by Dr. Last, or where he's cited, where he's brought up in conversation. And certainly some of my favorite conversations have been with Dr. Last, and it's always been an honor and a pleasure to have those opportunities. Inspiration is something that could be lacking from philosophy, especially in a university setting. If anything, you want to avoid the class because reading the First Critique or reading Kant sucks. You're not very inspired, especially when the professor does not make the text alive. And I think a good teacher makes the text alive, where it feels like there is a being, there is a soul, a spirit, a heart, a beating. The pages are beating like a heart. They're beating on you to, you must change your life, like the poem goes with the statue of Rilke. You must change your life. And I think good philosophers, good teachers, in fact, tell you with other words, you must change your life. And Dr. Last accomplishes that. Another dimension of Dr. Last's work that I think is very impressive is the interconnectability of it all. He did his thesis on the global brain singularity. We had a conversation about that. He's obvious, and I will note also, I think Mr. Bard is correct in, I think, a parallax conversation. He said that the lecture series that Dr. Last did on Less Than Nothing by Zizek is better than the book itself. I concur. I think the lecture series is extraordinary, and Zupancha on What is Sex, that is an extraordinary series as well. All of those series are amazing. The Hegel lectures of the class that he did are amazing. And it's what's so fascinating too, another thing that I think is just speaks to his ability to teach, is you go through the lecture and you're like, yeah, yes. It's not like it's like, yes, that's exactly what Hegel's getting at. And I don't mean that in a way where there's no confronting the text or fighting with the text, but it's just presented so smoothly that even when Cadell is reviewing and reading one of the more complicated or difficult passages in Hegel, it feels very, it just flows. It just makes it, yes, that makes sense. Yes, I see how that connects all together. And, oh, I get it. Now, one may, after understanding the different stages in the phenomenological journey, one may disagree with Hegel. That's fine. But there's a difference between disagreeing and apprehending. And very often, we tend to confuse not apprehending with disagreeing. We'll say I disagree when really what happened is we didn't apprehend. And that's not a real disagreement, in my opinion. I mean, you could make arguments about this, but to really disagree, you have to apprehend, you have to understand. And actually, real disagreement in that sense is very rare in the society. Well, Dr. Last, on some of these more difficult thinkers, makes it possible to have real disagreement precisely because you have real understanding. And also because he helps you have real understanding, can also help you advance the conversation. It's very clear that most readings of Nietzsche, especially in a popular level, have been misreadings. It's very difficult to advance a conversation that Nietzsche started if you don't understand Nietzsche. So the work, not only does Dr. Last inspire you, say with Nietzsche, he also makes it possible to progress the conversation. And I think also because of the work he's doing, it's, say, for example, clear. It becomes clear. You can see how Nietzsche and Hegel can be put together, which is an effort that has not been done. But in order to, well, it's a twofold thing, because, you yourself say apprehending that and saying, oh, there are ways to combine Nietzsche and Hegel is a great accomplishment, and that's one thing. But the ability to also bring other people along in that realization, which would require successful teaching, which would require clear articulation, and then inspiration and excitement to carry out that undertaking, that's an entirely different matter. And Dr. Last can do both. And for that, I am very grateful. As I was saying, Dr. Last did his PhD thesis on the global brain singularity, and there are distinctions between that and the technological singularity, all of which I've come to understand thanks to his work. Then he does work on Zizek's Less Than Nothing. Then he does work on What is Sex, Hegel, phenomenology, so on and so forth. Freud. All of these relate. All of these are part of the same conversation. It's one thing to say have a lot of philosophers will talk about having a Wittgenstein phase and then a Nietzsche phase and a Derrida phase, so on and so on and so on. And they're not really related. They're just phases of thought that one found interesting, but they kind of leave them behind. It's an entirely another thing to have phases per se, but the phases are actually different instruments in the same orchestra, in the same song, if you will. They're not identical, but they also play together to make something greater than themselves that cannot be reduced to each individual part. Dr. Last will stress with the with the singularity, global brain singularity, which can be, you have the global brain singularity, which could be kind of controlling the brain, maybe something more akin to China, where the singularity, as people talk about, this ever acceleration of technological progress, Ray Kurzweil, so on, and how we're heading toward the singularity. And there's these notions that, Kurzweil talks about being able to have sex as a woman, and then, Dr. Cadell Last will point at that and say, isn't it interesting that the talk of the singularity can have this kind of objectivity, impersonal element to it, but really there is a personal desire that is behind the effort toward that singularity. Isn't that interesting? The lurking subject, if you will, not lurking might be a strong term, but the subject behind what is going on is something that Dr. Last is always very interested in and always exploring. What is the subject behind the singularity that has certain visions of what they think the singularity can be that they believe will help them escape from themselves? What is the subject, the person, the desire that is lurking behind our technologies that we hope our technologies can fulfill, that actually what will easily occur is the arriving of that technology will simply unveil the impossibility of overcoming that essential lack, Lacan, that because we think we can overcome it until that very last minute, you think you can, when you encounter the no longer plausibly deniable reality that you cannot escape it, you will probably have a pathological response. And that this great moment of supposed beatific vision actually ends up being the great moment of horror, the great apocalypse in a negative way. I think it's very interesting. If you take the Bible, there's many visions of the apocalypse, but you have this one in Isaiah where the lamb lies down with the lion, the snake is trampled underfoot, so on and so forth. And then, of course, you have the book of Revelation with the horror on the beast of Babylon and blood in the cup and all that. There's a sense in which the Bible almost presents a choice. And, there's a choice between an N.T. Wright and Thomas in the recent mimetic desire conversation on Nietzsche was mentioning this idea of apocalypse, which is apparently found in Girard, is the idea that the apocalypse is a choice. You can choose for it to be horrific, or you can choose yourself for it to be something that unveils that, in fact, humanity did rise to the occasion and, say, overcame the temptations of mimetic desire or so on and so on. That choice, if you will, that double possibility, that contingency, that maybe or, that's lurking, in my opinion, a lot behind the work of Dr. Last. This idea that it is not given that the singularity will be a good thing, but it's also not given that it will be a bad thing. It's contingent. I think this notion of progress is indeed found in Hegel. There is a notion that, yes, the future will be better than the past, but there's no guarantee we'll make it. So there's a contingency, and the contingent element is profoundly located in the subject. What do humans do? What do we call ourselves forth to become? There's a stress on become in Cadell Last and many of the philosophers of today, because there's this idea that the sense of a stable self means that there's no work we have to do. We're just ourselves, and we are going to go into the future and be ourselves. Well, if instead there's this notion that we are a constant process, we're more mobilistic than eternalistic, to use Mr. Bard's language, you could more process. You could talk about a Whitehead, a Bergson, a Deleuze, so on. If we're more process, and that process unfolds in a certain manner relative to who we are and how we condition ourselves and what we do, well, then we have a lot of work that we need to do every single day. We need to rise to the occasion of ourselves. We need to overman ourselves. Dr. Last was noting how in Nietzsche the will to power is not a power over others, but a power over yourself. We all have natural tendencies to say, think in terms of being and complete identity as opposed to accepting and integrating with lack and accepting absolute knowing. We all have tendencies to be the last man as opposed to the overman. And if we just kind of, if we set ourselves and forget it, we end up as last men, not overmen. Well, if the last man encounters the singularity, it will probably be a very bad apocalypse. It will probably not be a good apocalypse. So, if you accept this premise that the singularity is coming, that there's some inevitability to it, there's certainly an inevitability to increased interconnectivity, globalization, networks, and so on. If we are not ready for that, then the consequences are going to be quite dire. And if you accept the premise that we're probably going to head in the direction of increased interconnectivity, singularity, acceleration of technological change, then it is very, very important that human beings condition themselves, prepare themselves for these transformations. But how do we do that? What does that look like? Well, with this idea of this inevitable singularity that's coming, Dr. Last then returns to Freud. He then looks to Zizek and that conception of a self-relating negativity. He then looks to, say, I mentioned Freud, all the challenges of coming to terms with the psyche, with the subconscious, consciousness, the libido, desire. All of these have to be taken very seriously. And they have to be taken very seriously because we cannot look for a solution in, say, the right system or the right ideas, something external to ourselves, that if we just get the right external environment, then everything's going to be great and we're going to take care of ourselves. And of course, there are environmental factors. Of course, we are influenced by what is around us in the settings that we are in. Mr. Daniel Frege has spoken very well on that topic with his book, Ontological Design. But it's a two-way street. It's a feedback loop. We are indeed changed by our environments, but we also change our environments. We are created by our tools, but we also create our tools. It's a two-way street. It's not merely one or the other. Perhaps in some incidences, it's more so one than the other, and other times it's more so the other than the one, so on. But how we're going to create our environments and our settings and undergo ontological design will be relative to the kind of subject we are, the kind of person we are, the way that we've come to terms with our desires and ourselves. The language, I would say, is how we condition ourselves, like going to the gym. And relative to how we condition ourselves, that has a big impact on the conditions that we have met of the world to experience the world differently. So how we are conditioned impacts the conditions that we meet, that transforms what we experience, which in turn changes how we can further condition ourselves, and so on and so on. It's conditionally, it's work. There's an actual physical, psychological, mental, sexual work that has to be done to so condition ourselves. The subject has to go to the gym. Dr. Last is exploring many ways that we can say, go to the gym. What does it look like to go to the gym as a subject? What does it look like to condition ourselves? And if we don't, again, the singularity will probably look to be some kind of apocalypse and probably won't be too good. Well, we need to return to Freud. Well, we need to understand the trauma of sex that Ms. Zupancha is going to talk about. If we're not ready for that, then we have sex and we find out that a return to the womb primordial unity is impossible, and then we are neurotic and pathological. And if we're neurotic and pathological, we're not going to be ready for increased interconnectivity. It will existentially overwhelm us, and we'll probably turn to a strong man, meaning crisis, all these different terms. Now, it's very important. We never can totally overcome our neurosis. One has to learn to love the symptom, to use that language. So I'm not saying that we can ever fix ourselves, but there is something, we can die better, is the language that Dr. Last will use. We can fail better, if you will. Absolute knowing requires a perpetual reconstitution and a perpetual act. But the one who daily tries to carry out that act is not equal to the one that never carries it out, or only carries it out once. So even though there is no completion, there is progress. There can be movement, there can be advancement, even if there cannot be completion. It is a mistake to believe that the inability of completion equals the non-existence of progress. And if we're to have any hope of perhaps not destroying ourselves or coming to terms with ourselves and the challenge of ourselves into this subject that we find ourselves in, then we need to learn how to properly condition ourselves and to carry ourselves. And thus we return to Zupancha. Thus we return to Freud. Thus we look to Zizek. Thus we read Hegel anew. Thus we see a phenomenological journey that's going to require stages of negation and sublation. Very often when we think about progress, we have from the general culture just kind of building up. There's no room of negation. There's no space for the thought of negation. Hegel would have us understand that negation is a necessary element in sublation and a kind of progress in terms of the subject. Well, if you don't know that, and you're in life and you encounter negation, you're going to carry with you the notion that that tension is bad, because that's what the culture teaches you. Therefore, you'll suffer the tension and you'll stop yourself. You'll stop it, thinking that that's the right thing to do, because ideas have consequences. If you have the wrong ideas, then you will interpret the emotional experiences differently than you would if you had a different set of ideas. Dr. Last provides us with the ideas to interpret tension as good, to interpret difficulty as good, which we exist in a culture that would have us interpret the opposite, which means you basically, in a sense, have a culture of effacement, of self-destruction, of a bad death. Now, to Mr. Ebert's defense, there is a good death, because if we don't integrate with death, we become cancerous. But there is also a bad death, in the same way that there's a good life and a bad life, and so on and so forth. A life that avoids tension is a life that will end in a bad death, and it will arguably be dying until death. It will be dying every day more than living every day. And that's something that Nietzsche understood. That's something that Hegel provides us resources to understand. And this will then get us into the great question of what do we do now? There's discussions to be had on Tantra Sutra. There's conversations to be had on, as Dr. Last is doing, on Nietzsche. What does it look like to deal with our current moment and our current situation? And another thing Dr. Last emphasizes that I like very much is the notion that we cannot jump ahead. We can't jump ahead. We have to think the now. We have to base our thinking on the now. That is the concrete. That is the concretion. And I do, the other thing I will note, I'm a big fan of, say, the pure Peirce, pragmatism, thinkers of that nature. Dr. Last has a strong pragmatic thrust to his thinking that I greatly appreciate. And it's very rare that one encounters philosophical thought that then helps them practice and carry themselves in the world. And that is the work that Dr. Last is doing. That is the work that all philosophy needs to be doing. That is the work that if we do not do, we probably will not be ready for, conditioned for what's coming. And the challenges of increased diversity, the challenges of increased interconnectivity, the challenges of unleashed libido, a world of pure release and no givens. That requires a lot of work and conditioning to be able to handle. Otherwise, the resulting existential anxiety will likely overwhelm us. There are very few thinkers, in my opinion, who are aware of this entire situation, of the now, of the world today, let alone individuals that help us rise to the occasion of the now in the world today. This is the work that Dr. Last is doing. He has a class starting on Nietzsche quite soon, July 15th. You can find more on Philosophy Portal. You should sign up. It's an important undertaking that he is engaged in. And today we celebrate him and we celebrate the work that he is doing. Dr. Cadell Last, thank you for being you, and happy birthday.